On Highway 17, there's a small diner called the Hollow Diner. Most people just see it as a dreary rest stop. But for Mark Turner, it was a sanctuary. He came here to escape the squeal of tires and the endless questions after an accident 3 years ago. Mark thought the quiet of the night shift would be his cure, but the Hollow Diner was not quiet. It had a regular customer who arrived at 3:03 a.m., a man who never paid and never left. And then Mark realized the bell at the door wasn't just for greeting guests. It was a summons. And that customer, he was waiting to pass his debt on to a new person, to Mark. This is the story of Mark Turner, about a night shift that never ends. If you love chilling true horror stories, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next. Chapter 1. First Night Alone. The diner sat like a forgotten relic on the edge of Highway 17, its neon sign flickering weakly against the winter night. It was February 2001, and the air outside was heavy with frost, the kind that clung to your breath and turned it to fleeting clouds. Inside, the Hollow Diner glowed faintly under fluorescent lights, their hum a constant companion to the tick of the wall clock. Mark Turner, 29 and tired, leaned against the counter, wiping the same spot for the third time. The rag smelled faintly of bleach, sharp enough to sting his nose. The place was empty. It always was this late, past midnight, when the world seemed to hold its breath. Beyond the large glass windows, the parking lot stretched into darkness, broken only by a single street lamp casting a sickly yellow glow. The cold seeped through the glass, brushing against Mark's knuckles as he worked. He didn't mind the quiet, not really. It was better than the noise of his old life. The screech of tires, the endless questions after the accident. 3 years ago, that sound had carved itself into his memory, sharp as a blade. He shook his head, trying to dislodge it, and focused on the clock. 1:47 a.m. Still hours to go. Linda, the other night shift server, was bundling up by the door, her scarf wrapped tight around her neck. She was older, maybe 40, with laugh lines that didn't match the unease in her eyes. "You sure you're good alone, Mark?" she asked, her voice muffled by the scarf. "First solo night's always the worst." "I'll manage," Mark said, offering a half smile. He didn't feel like talking, not tonight. The weight of the shift was already settling into his bones. Linda hesitated, her hand on the door. "One thing," she said, her tone dropping low, like she was sharing a secret she didn't quite believe. "Don't look out the windows after 3. Not for long anyway." She laughed, but it was thin, brittle. "Just don't." Mark raised an eyebrow, waiting for the punchline. None came. The bell above the door jingled as Linda stepped out, the sound sharp and fleeting, swallowed by the night. He watched her silhouette fade into the fog, her footsteps crunching faintly on the gravel. Then silence. Just the clock ticking, the coffee machine hissing softly in the corner, and the faint whistle of wind outside. He busied himself restocking sugar packets, the paper crinkling under his fingers. The diner smelled of old grease and burnt coffee, familiar enough to be comforting. But the quiet was different tonight, heavier, like the air was waiting for something. Mark glanced at the clock again. 2:30 a.m. The world outside was still, the fog pressing against the windows like a living thing, curling and shifting in the dim light. He moved to the coffee machine, the glass pot warm under his palm. The liquid inside was black as ink, reflecting the overhead lights in tiny wavering stars. As he poured himself a cup, the steam curled upward, carrying a faint bitterness that grounded him. He took a sip, wincing at the heat, and set the cup down. The clock ticked on. 2:58 a.m. The wind stopped. Mark noticed it all at once. The absence of sound, like the night had swallowed itself whole. The diner felt smaller, the walls closer, the fluorescent lights colder. He stood still, his breath shallow, waiting for something to break the silence. And then it came. Leng Keng. The bell above the door rang, a single clear note that cut through the quiet like a knife. Mark froze, his hand still on the coffee pot. The sound lingered, vibrating in the air, sharper than it should have been. He turned slowly toward the door, expecting to see a late-night traveler, maybe a trucker, pulling in for a quick meal. But the door was still. No one had come in. He stepped toward the window, his boots squeaking faintly on the linoleum floor. The glass was cold, fogged slightly at the edges, and beyond it, the parking lot was empty. No cars, no headlights, just the street lamp, flickering like a dying star. Mark's reflection stared back at him, pale and hollow-eyed, his dark hair falling messily over his forehead. He leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass, and squinted into the darkness. There, at the edge of the lot, where the asphalt met the road, something stood. A figure, tall and thin, draped in a long coat that didn't move, despite the faint wind picking up again. Its head was bowed, a hood obscuring its face, and it was utterly still, like a statue carved from shadow. Mark's heart thudded, a dull ache in his chest. He blinked, and the figure seemed to shift, closer now, though he hadn't seen it move. He stepped back, the cold from the window lingering on his skin. The bell didn't ring again, but the silence felt wrong, too heavy, like it was hiding something. He glanced at the clock. 3:03 a.m. The second hand ticked forward, steady, unyielding. Mark swallowed, his throat dry, and turned away from the window. Linda's warning echoed in his mind, absurd, but impossible to shake. Under the counter, tucked among napkins and stray receipts, he found something else. A slip of paper, yellowed and brittle, half buried under a stack of menus. It was an old diner bill, dated October 17th, 1981. The order was simple: black coffee, no sugar, and a slice of apple pie. The time scrawled at the top was 3:03 a.m. Under customer name, someone had written a single word in smudged ink: unknown. The total was unpaid. Mark stared at the paper, his fingers cold against its edges. A faint dampness clung to it, as if it had been left out in the rain. He set it down, his pulse quickening, and glanced at the window again. The figure was gone, or maybe it had never been there. The fog swirled, thicker now, and the street lamp flickered once before steadying. The clock ticked on. The night stretched ahead, endless and waiting. Chapter 2. The Unpaid Bill. The hollow diner was quieter the next night. If such a thing were possible, the fog outside had thickened, pressing against the windows like a heavy curtain, swallowing the faint glow of the street lamp. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint tang of grease and something sharper, like metal left too long in the cold. Mark Turner moved slowly behind the counter, his boots dragging on the linoleum, each step echoing faintly in the empty space. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its hands creeping toward 1:00 a.m. He hadn't slept well after his first shift. The memory of that bell, linking, and the figure in the fog, lingering like a bad dream. He tried to focus on the routine, wiping down the counter, restocking the napkin dispenser, checking the coffee machine. The machine gurgled softly, its warmth a small comfort against the chill that seemed to seep through the diner's walls. Mark's fingers brushed the edge of the counter, where the unpaid bill from 1981 still sat, tucked beneath a stack of menus. He hadn't touched it since finding it, but its presence gnawed at him, like a word stuck on the tip of his tongue. The smudged ink, the name unknown, the time 3:03 a.m. It all felt wrong, like a puzzle piece that didn't fit. The bell above the door chimed, this time with purpose. Mark looked up, startled, as the door swung open, letting in a gust of cold air that carried the faint scent of diesel. Gary, a regular trucker, stepped inside, his heavy boots thudding against the floor. He was a broad man, nearing 50, with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to carry too many miles. His jacket was dusted with frost, and he rubbed his hands together as he slid onto a stool at the counter. "Evening, Mark," Gary said, his voice low and gravelly, like he'd smoked one too many cigarettes. "Coffee, black, and whatever pie's fresh. Demia." Mark nodded, pouring a cup from the pot. The steam rose in lazy curls, and he slid the mug across the counter, the ceramic warm against his palm. "Apples all we got," he said, keeping his tone even. He didn't feel like small talk, not after last night. Gary grunted, taking a sip. The clock ticked on, filling the silence. Mark busied himself, slicing a piece of pie, the knife's edge scraping softly against the tin. He could feel Gary watching him, not in a threatening way, but with a weight that made the air feel heavier. "You settling in okay?" Gary asked, his eyes flicking toward the windows, then back to Mark. "Night shift's a different beast." "It's fine," Mark said, setting the plate down. The pie's crust glistened under the fluorescent lights, its scent sweet and faintly spiced. He wanted to ask about the figure he'd seen, about the bell, but the words felt foolish, childish even. Instead, he leaned against the counter, his fingers brushing the edge of that old bill again. Gary took a bite of pie, chewing slowly. "Heard about the 303 guest yet?" he said, his tone casual, but laced with something else. Amusement maybe, or caution. "Old story around here. Linda loves telling it." Mark's stomach tightened. Linda's warning about the windows still echoed in his head, and now this. "She mentioned something," he said carefully. "Sounded like a joke." Gary chuckled, but it was a dry, humorless sound. Maybe it is. Folks say there's a customer who shows up at 3:03 a.m., right on the dot. Never orders much, just sits there. Been happening since, well, since before you were born, probably. He paused, his fork hovering over the pie. They say he don't leave till someone takes his place. Mark forced a laugh, but it came out weak. Sounds like a ghost story to scare newbies. Gary's eyes met his, steady and unblinking. Could be. But you ever notice how some nights this place feels off, like it's waiting for something? He tapped his fork against the plate, a faint clink that seemed too loud in the quiet. Just don't stare too long at the dark, kid. It stares back. The words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been. Mark turned away, pretending to adjust the coffee machine, but his pulse quickened. He didn't like how Gary's words mirrored the unease he'd felt last night, the way the fog seemed to watch him through the glass. Gary left soon after, leaving a crumpled $10 bill on the counter. The door swung shut behind him, the bell chiming once, sharp and clear. Mark stood alone again, the diner's silence settling around him like dust. He glanced at the clock, 2:45 a.m., too close to 3 o'clock for comfort. He started cleaning the counter again, more to keep his hands busy than anything else. As he moved a stack of menus, the unpaid bill slipped free, fluttering to the floor. He crouched to pick it up, and his fingers brushed against it, cold and slightly damp, as if it had been left out in the rain. A long, wet streak ran across the paper, smudging the ink further. Mark frowned, turning it over. The handwriting was faint, but the details were clear. Black coffee, apple pie, 3:03 a.m., unknown. He set it back on the counter, his throat dry. The clock ticked closer to 3 o'clock. The air grew colder, sharper, like a blade pressed against his skin. Mark glanced at the security camera monitor tucked under the counter, its grainy black and white feed showing the empty parking lot. He tapped the screen, half expecting it to flicker, but it held steady, just fog and asphalt, nothing else. Then, at exactly 3:03 a.m., the bell rang again. Lenkeng. Louder this time, insistent, like someone had pushed the door with purpose. Mark's head snapped toward the entrance, but it was still, the glass unmarred by fingerprints or smudges. No one was there. His breath caught, forming faint clouds in the air. The diner felt colder now, the kind of cold that sank into your bones and stayed there. He checked the camera again, his fingers trembling slightly. The feed showed the parking lot, empty as before, but something was wrong. A shadow, tall, thin, indistinct, flashed across the bottom of the screen, gone before he could be sure. He rewound the footage, his heart pounding, but the shadow didn't reappear. Just static, then the empty lot again. Mark stepped back, his boots squeaking on the floor. The smell hit him then, faint but unmistakable. Something acrid, like burnt rubber or overheated brakes. It lingered in the air, curling into his lungs. He glanced at the clock. The second hand ticked forward, steady, relentless. 3:04 a.m. Outside, the fog pressed closer, and the street lamp flickered once, twice, then held. Mark kept his eyes on the counter, on the unpaid bill with its damp streak, and tried not to think about what might be waiting in the dark. Chapter 3. Through the Window. The hollow diner felt like a tomb by the third night. The cold outside was relentless, seeping through the cracks around the windows, curling around Mark Turner's ankles like invisible hands. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting sharp shadows that flickered when he wasn't looking. He stood behind the counter, his eyes heavy, the weight of sleepless nights pressing against his temples. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its hands inching toward 2:30 a.m., each second a small rebellion against the silence. Mark's fingers traced the edge of the unpaid bill from 1981, still tucked beneath the menus. The damp streak across it had dried, but the paper felt brittle, as if it might crumble under his touch. He hadn't told Linda about it, or about the shadow on the camera last night, her warnings about the windows, Gary's half-joking tale about the 303 guest. They clung to him, weaving into the unease that had settled in his chest. He pushed the bill out of sight, trying to focus on the routine. The coffee machine hissed softly, its warmth a faint shield against the growing chill. He poured himself a cup, the liquid steaming as it filled the mug. The scent was bitter, grounding, but it couldn't shake the memory of that bell, Lenkeng, or the figure in the fog. Mark sipped the coffee, wincing at the heat, and glanced at the windows. The fog outside was thicker tonight, a grey veil that swallowed the parking lot whole. The street lamp's glow was barely a pinprick, flickering, like a candle about to gutter out. He tried to stay busy, wiping down the counter, rearranging salt shakers, anything to keep his mind from wandering. But the diner felt smaller tonight, the walls pressing in, the air heavy with something he couldn't name. His eyes drifted to the clock. 2:50 a.m. Too close. He turned away, focusing on the coffee machine. Its steady drip, a small comfort. Exhaustion tugged at him, his eyelids drooping as he leaned against the counter. The warmth of the mug in his hands faded, and his head nodded forward, just for a moment. The world blurred, the hum of the lights fading into a distant drone. He jerked awake, his heart lurching, the mug nearly slipping from his fingers. The clock read 3:02 a.m. The diner was silent, but it was the wrong kind of silent. Too absolute, like the world had stopped breathing. Mark's breath caught, forming faint clouds in the air. The temperature had dropped, sharp and sudden, his skin prickling under his jacket. He set the mug down, the ceramic clinking softly against the counter, and turned toward the dining area. There, at the far end of the diner, in the last booth by the window, someone sat. A tall, thin figure, draped in a long coat, its hood pulled low, casting shadows where a face should have been. The figure was still, its hands folded on the table, unmoving. Mark's pulse hammered in his ears, loud enough to drown out the clock. He hadn't heard the bell. He hadn't heard anything. He grabbed the coffee pot, more out of instinct than purpose, and walked toward the booth, his boots squeaking on the linoleum. The air grew colder with each step, the chill sinking into his bones. A faint smell crept into his nose, acrid, like burnt rubber, sharp enough to make his eyes water. He stopped a few feet from the booth, the pot trembling slightly in his hand. "Coffee?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge him. The hood obscured its face, but Mark felt it. Eyes watching, unseen, heavy with intent. He poured the coffee into a clean mug on the table, the steam rising in slow, lazy curls. The liquid glistened under the lights, untouched. He stepped back, his throat tight. "Anything else?" he tried, but the words felt hollow, swallowed by the silence. The figure remained still, a statue carved from shadow. Mark turned away, his heart racing, and walked back to the counter. He didn't look back, couldn't bring himself to. When he reached the counter, he glanced at the clock. 3:03 a.m. The second hand ticked forward, relentless. He forced himself to breathe, to focus on the familiar. The counter, the coffee machine, the unpaid bill. But then it came, sharp and piercing, cutting through the quiet. Leng King. The bell above the door rang, louder than before. A single note that vibrated in the air like a warning. Mark spun toward the entrance, expecting to see the door swinging, but it was still, the glass untouched. His eyes darted to the booth. It was empty. The coffee mug sat alone, steam still rising from it, as if someone had just been there. Then from outside, a sound endured through the night. A long, screeching wail, like tires skidding on wet asphalt. It stretched on, sharp and desperate, before cutting off abruptly, leaving only silence. Mark's breath caught, his chest tight. That sound, he knew it too well. The echo of his own accident 3 years ago, the moment his life had unraveled. His hands shook as he gripped the counter, the memory clawing at him. The air grew colder still, the burnt rubber smell stronger now, clinging to the back of his throat. He turned toward the kitchen, where the shadows seemed darker, thicker, pooling in the corners like spilled ink. Something moved there, just at the edge of his vision, a flicker, like a figure stepping out of sight. He froze, his skin crawling. The sensation of being watched so strong, it felt like a physical weight. He checked the security camera monitor, his fingers fumbling on the controls. The grainy feed showed the parking lot, empty except for the fog. No cars, no figures, nothing. But the shadows seemed to shift, curling at the edges of the frame. Mark blinked, his eyes burning, and looked away. The clock ticked on, 3:04 a.m. The coffee mug in the booth was still steaming when he glanced back, its surface rippling slightly, as if something had disturbed it. Mark stayed behind the counter, his heart pounding, and tried not to think about the eyes he felt watching from the kitchen, or the sound of brakes that still echoed in his mind. Chapter 4. Gary's Story. The hollow diner was a prison of light and shadow by the fourth night. The fog outside clung to the windows, thick and grey, muffling the world beyond. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of old grease and stale coffee. undercut by a faint, metallic chill that lingered in Mark Turner's throat. He stood behind the counter, his hands moving mechanically, wiping down surfaces that were already clean. The clock ticked relentlessly, its hands pointing to 10:45 p.m., each second a reminder of the hours stretching ahead, the memory of the previous night, the figure in the booth, the screech of brakes, the steaming coffee left untouched, clung to him like damp cloth. Mark's eyes flicked to the unpaid bill from 1981, still tucked under the menus. He hadn't touched it since yesterday, but its presence was a weight, a splinter in his mind. The name unknown, the time 3:03 a.m., the damp streak across the paper. It all felt like a message he couldn't read. He shook his head, trying to focus on the present, but the diner felt wrong tonight, as if the walls were holding their breath. The bell above the door chimed, sharp and clear, cutting through the quiet. Mark looked up as Linda stepped inside, her scarf wrapped tight against the cold. She was early for once, her shift ending soon, and her face carried a tension that didn't match her usual banter. Behind her, Gary followed, his heavy boots thudding against the linoleum. The trucker's jacket was dusted with frost, his eyes scanning the diner like he was looking for something he didn't want to find. "Coffee, Mark," Gary said, sliding onto a stool at the counter. His voice was gruff, but there was an edge to it, sharper than usual. "And make it quick." Mark nodded, pouring 2 cups, the steam curling upward like ghosts in the fluorescent light. He slid one to Gary and set the other in front of Linda, who lingered near the counter instead of heading to the back. The coffee's bitter scent filled the air, but it did little to ease the chill creeping up Mark's spine. Linda glanced at the clock, then at Mark. "You're still here," she said, her tone flat, not quite a question. "Thought you might have called in sick after last night." Mark shrugged, avoiding her eyes. He hadn't told her about the figure in the booth, or the brakes, or the way the kitchen shadows seemed to move. "Need the money," he said simply, his voice low. The truth was heavier. He needed to leave this town, to escape the memories of his own accident, the screech of tires that still haunted his dreams. Gary took a sip of coffee, his eyes fixed on the window where the fog pressed close, obscuring the parking lot. "You ever hear about the crash out front?" he asked, his voice casual but deliberate, like he was testing the waters. "Back in 81. Bad one." Mark's stomach tightened. The screech from last night echoed in his mind, sharp and raw. He leaned against the counter, his fingers brushing the edge of the unpaid bill. "Heard rumors," he said carefully. "What happened?" Gary set his mug down, the ceramic clinking softly. "Truck went off the road, right there." He nodded, toward the window, toward the invisible stretch of Highway 17. "Driver was a regular, used to stop here every few nights. Always at 3:03 a.m., like clockwork. Sat in that booth back there." He jerked his thumb toward the last booth, the one where the figure had been last night. "They found him out front, mangled. Hood was up, face all covered. Never figured out why he swerved." Mark's throat went dry. He glanced at the booth, its vinyl seats gleaming faintly under the lights. Empty, but somehow wrong. The air felt colder now, the kind of cold that sank into your bones and stayed. "That's it?" he asked. trying to keep his voice steady. Gary's eyes met his, steady and unyielding. Few days before he died, he started acting strange. Kept talking about the diner, how it felt. Off, like it was waiting for him. Always ordered the same thing. Coffee, black apple pie. Never finished it. He paused, his fingers tightening around the mug. Some say he's still here, looking for someone to take his place. Linda shifted, her scarf rustling. "Don't scare the kid, Gary," she said, but her voice lacked its usual lightness. She glanced at Mark, her eyes sharp. "You should quit the night shift, Mark, before you get stuck." "Stuck," Mark repeated, his pulse quickening. The word felt heavy, like a stone dropped into still water. Linda hesitated, then leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "People who stay too long, they get chosen. Become the next 303 guest. You don't want that." She straightened, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm out. See you tomorrow. Maybe." She grabbed her coat and headed for the door, the bell chiming, Leng Keng, as she left. Mark stood frozen, Linda's words sinking into him like the cold. Gary finished his coffee in silence, leaving a few bills on the counter before heading out. The bell rang again, sharp and fleeting, and then Mark was alone. The clock read 11:15 p.m. Hours to go. He busied himself cleaning, trying to ignore the weight of Gary's story. The diner was silent, except for the clock's ticking and the coffee machine's faint hiss. But as the night wore on, the silence grew heavier, oppressive, like it was hiding something. Mark glanced at the clock. 2:55 a.m. His heart thudded, a dull ache in his chest. At 3:03 a.m., the bell rang again. Leng Keng. Louder, closer, as if someone had brushed the door without opening it. Mark's breath caught, his eyes darting to the entrance. The door was still, the glass unmarred. But the air turned frigid, his breath forming clouds that lingered too long. The smell of burnt rubber crept in, faint at first, then stronger, stinging his nose. Then he heard it, a soft, deliberate sound from behind the counter where the kitchen door stood ajar. Footsteps, slow, measured, like someone pacing just out of sight. Mark froze, his hands gripping the counter, the wood cold under his palms. He was alone. He knew he was alone, but the footsteps continued, steady, unhurried, moving closer, then stopping abruptly. He didn't turn around. He couldn't. The shadows in the kitchen seemed darker now, thicker, pooling like ink in the corners. The clock ticked on, relentless. 3:04 a.m. The footsteps didn't return, but the silence that followed was worse, heavy with the weight of something watching, waiting, just out of reach. Chapter 5. The Last Order. Rain lashed against the windows of the hollow diner, a relentless patter that blurred the world outside into a gray haze. It was the fifth night, and the air inside felt thick, heavy with the scent of wet linoleum and burnt coffee. Mark Turner stood behind the counter, his hands trembling as he polished a glass that didn't need it. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight, each second a weight pressing against his chest. The events of the past nights, the bell, the figure, the footsteps, the screech of brakes had burrowed into his mind, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. He hadn't slept properly in days, his reflection in the diner's windows pale and hollow, like a ghost staring back. The unpaid bill from 1981 sat on the counter now, no longer hidden. Its yellowed edges curled slightly, the damp streak across it darker, as if it had been touched by the rain outside. Mark avoided looking at it, but its presence was a pulse. A reminder of Gary's story about the trucker, of Linda's warning about being replaced. He wanted to quit, to walk out and never come back. But the need for money and the fear of what might follow him kept him rooted. The diner was empty, as it always was this late. The coffee machine hissed softly, its warmth a faint comfort against the chill that seemed to live in the walls now. Outside, the rain drowned out the usual sounds of the highway, leaving only the hum of the fluorescent lights and the clock's relentless ticking. Mark glanced at the security camera monitor, its grainy feed showing nothing but rain-slicked asphalt and the faint glow of the street lamp, flickering like a heartbeat. The clock read 2:55 a.m. Mark's breath caught, his fingers tightening around the rag. The air felt heavier, the silence deeper, like the diner was holding its breath. He moved to the coffee machine, pouring a fresh pot, the steam rising in slow curls that vanished into the cold. The scent was bitter, sharp, but it couldn't mask the faint, acrid smell that crept in. Burnt rubber, like a tire scorched on pavement. His heart thudded, a dull ache that matched the clock's rhythm. At exactly 3:03 a.m., the bell rang, linking. It was sharp, deliberate, echoing through the diner like a summons. Mark froze, his eyes darting to the door. It didn't move, the glass untouched, but the sound lingered, vibrating in the air. The temperature plummeted, his breath forming clouds that hung before his face. The burnt rubber smell grew stronger, stinging his nose, clinging to his throat like smoke. The door swung open, slow and silent, despite the bell. A figure stepped inside, a tall, thin shape draped in a long coat, its hood pulled low, obscuring its face. It moved with an unnatural stillness, the rain not touching its clothes, no drops falling to the floor. It crossed the diner in 3 long strides and sat in the last booth, the one by the window, the same booth from Gary's story. Its hands folded on the table, unmoving, shadows pooling where a face should have been. Mark's pulse roared in his ears. He wanted to stay behind the counter, to ignore it, but his feet moved, drawn forward as if pulled by a string. He grabbed the coffee pot and a menu, his hands shaking, and approached the booth. The air grew colder with each step, the chill sinking into his bones, his skin prickling under his jacket. The figure didn't look up, didn't move, but Mark felt its presence, heavy and watchful. "Coffee?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, cracking on the word. The figure's head tilted slightly, the hood shifting just enough to reveal the outline of a jaw, sharp and pale. A low, rasping voice came from the shadows, soft but clear, like a whisper carried on the wind. Coffee black, apple pie. The words were precise, matching the order on the unpaid bill exactly. Mark's stomach twisted, but he nodded, turning back to the counter. He poured the coffee, the pot trembling in his hands, and sliced a piece of pie, the knife scraping against the tin. The scent of apples and cinnamon mingled with the burnt rubber smell, creating a sickening contrast. He carried the order to the booth, his boots squeaking on the linoleum, each step louder in the silence. The figure was still, its hands unmoving, the hood casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the light. Mark set the mug and played down, the coffee steaming, its surface rippling slightly under the flickering lights. He stepped back, his heart pounding, and forced himself to look at the figure. The hood lifted, just enough. For the first time, Mark saw its face, or what should have been a face. It was his own, but older, haggard, the skin sallow and stretched tight over sharp bones. The eyes were sunken, dark pits that held no light. But they stared at him, unblinking, with a weight that pinned him in place. His own face, but wrong, like a mirror twisted by time and decay. "It's your turn," the figure whispered, its voice a low hiss, like air escaping a tire. The words sank into Mark, cold and heavy, carrying the weight of inevitability. The lights in the diner flickered, buzzing loudly, casting jagged shadows across the booth. The air grew colder still, the burnt rubber smell overwhelming, choking. Outside, a sound tore through the rain, a long screeching wail, the sound of tires skidding, brakes screaming against asphalt. It stretched on, sharp and desperate, echoing the accident from 1981, echoing Mark's own crash 3 years ago. His hands shook, the memory clawing at him, blurring the line between then and now. The figure didn't move, its eyes, his eyes, still locked on him. The lights flickered again, then steadied. Mark stumbled back, his breath ragged, and glanced at the clock. 3:04 a.m. The booth was empty. The coffee mug sat untouched, steam still rising, the pie uneaten. The bell didn't ring again, but the silence was worse, thick with the weight of what he'd seen. His own face, staring back, whispering his fate. Chapter 6. The Endless Shift. The morning after the 5th night broke over the hollow diner, pale and grey, the sky heavy with the threat of more rain. The fog had lifted, but the air outside remained cold, sharp enough to sting the skin. Linda pushed open the door at 6:00 a.m., her boots crunching on the gravel as she stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed, Leng Keng, a single hollow note that echoed in the empty diner. She paused, her breath catching, the sound sharper than it should have been in the early light. The diner was still, too still. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. The coffee machine sat silent, its usual hiss absent, the pot cold and empty. The air carried a faint trace of burnt rubber, so subtle it might have been her imagination, but it clung to the back of her throat. Linda's eyes swept the room, searching for Mark. The counter was bare, The stools untouched, the booths empty. But something felt wrong, like the diner was holding a secret it refused to share. She called his name, her voice thin in the silence. Mark. No answer. The clock on the wall stared back, its hands frozen at 3:03 a.m., the second hand motionless, as if time itself had given up. Linda's stomach twisted, a cold knot of dread settling in her chest. She stepped toward the counter, her footsteps loud in the quiet, and stopped short. There, on the polished surface, lay a single slip of paper, a diner bill, fresh and crisp. Unlike the yellowed one from 1981, Linda's fingers hesitated before picking it up, the paper cool against her skin. The handwriting was Mark's, neat, deliberate, unmistakable. The order: black coffee, apple pie. The time: 3:03 a.m. Under customer name, a single word in smudged ink: unknown. The total was unpaid, a damp streak running across the paper, as if it had been touched by wet fingers. Linda's breath hitched. She set the bill down, her hands trembling, and glanced at the last booth by the window. It was empty, the vinyl seats gleaming under the lights, but a faint warmth lingered in the air, as if someone had just left. The memory of her own warning to Mark, "Before you get stuck," echoed in her mind, heavy with regret. She hadn't believed it, not really, but the diner felt different now, like it had claimed something. Outside, a truck's engine rumbled, cutting through the morning's stillness. Gary's rig pulled into the parking lot, its headlights slicing through the lingering mist. He stepped out, his heavy coat dusted with frost, and approached the diner's entrance. He paused at the door, his hand on the handle, his eyes fixed on the glass. There, reflected in the window, stood a figure, tall, thin, draped in a long coat, its hood pulled low, obscuring its face. It was still, unmoving, the rain from last night somehow absent from its clothes. Gary's breath fogged the glass, his heart pounding. He blinked, and the figure was gone, the reflection showing only the empty parking lot and the flickering street lamp. The air grew colder, a chill that sank into his bones, carrying the faint, acrid scent of burnt rubber. He pushed the door open, and the bell rang again. Linking, louder, sharper, a sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. The diner was empty. Linda stood behind the counter, her face pale, the bill still in her hand. Gary's eyes met hers, a silent question passing between them. Neither spoke. The clock remained frozen at 3:03 a.m., its ticking absent, the silence heavier than ever. Outside, the highway stretched into the distance, shrouded in mist, waiting. The bell rang once more, linking, though the door didn't move. The sound lingered, a final note that faded into the morning, leaving only the weight of what had been lost and what might come again. And then the bell rang one more time. But this time, it wasn't a warning. It was a handover. Mark had become a part of the horror that Gary and Linda had witnessed. The clock still stands still at 3:03 a.m., and the bell still echoes in the darkness. Perhaps Mark's shift never ends. He has become trapped, one of those who tried to escape their pasts, only to return to where they truly belong. The Hollow Diner is not a restaurant. It is a trap for those who cannot face their guilt. And Mark Turner, he walked right into it. This story is a warning to anyone who thinks they can run from their past. The Hollow Diner and its ghostly bell still exist, waiting for people like Mark, who carry burdens they cannot let go of. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to leave a like, share with a friend, and let me know your scariest experiences in the comments below. Do you believe in these stories?